It's great to be with you all. It was a long time coming. I think it was a year and a half or so ago that we first booked this. But in spite of the virus, in spite of all this delay, again, it's great to be with you, even if it is from a distance. Let me begin this way. Almost a decade ago, I started this tradition with my kids. I have 3 children. They're now 31, 29, and 25. And I proposed to them that when they graduated college, I would take them anywhere they wanted to go in the world for a week. I didn't necessarily inform my wife before I made that deal with my kids, but it's worked out okay. Trust us, we're all right. My oldest graduated almost a decade ago, I guess, from the University of Tennessee in the School of Architecture. And so he was the first. And I said, so Michael, anywhere in the world, where do you want to go? And he said, I would like to do the Camino de Santiago, the trail across Spain. And I said, son, that is way more than a week. I'm not sure that's part of the deal. But we worked it out, and I got a sabbatical from my job as a pastor. And for 28 days, 450 miles, we walked. And the fascinating part of this is a 250,000 people a year walk the Camino de Santiago. It means the way of St. James. The history of it is based upon James the Apostle, that after the resurrection of Jesus, supposedly he went to northwest Spain, he evangelized, he told the story of Jesus. We read in Acts that he was killed in Jerusalem, and the tradition, the legend is that his body was carried back by his disciples to northwest Spain. There they buried him. And then there became this tradition to make a spiritual pilgrimage across Spain to retrace the steps that his disciples had walked with the body of James. And that's how all this got started. So the Camino is a spiritual pilgrimage. One of the most fascinating parts of this walk were the people that we met. You're walking again we walked for 28 days. So over meals in the hostels where you stay, just walking the roads, just walking the trails. And here are some pictures of some of them. Some that we knew their names. There was Mark from Ireland and Larissa from Germany. There was Stephen and Chloe from Vermont. There were a lot of English speakers. Bonnie and Chris from Chattanooga, still friends with to this day. Actually, they're just a few miles from me here in Knoxville. Phil from Ireland, a father and daughter, Larry and Jeanette from Colorado. And some people, we didn't know their names, but we saw them over and over again on the trail, and we just called them by who they reminded us of. There was this one boy that I called Jack Kerouac. He wore this big floppy hat, and he walked around saying things like, people tell me I know so much for a 22-year-old. You know, he thought he was really cool. There was the Australian foot massage lady. She had kind of a fetish. There was the angry sleeping man. We came upon him in a couple hostels. Who you didn't cross him. There was the 18-year-old Aussie who thought he was going to die on the mountain and made a video saying goodbye to his family and friends. All of these different type of people we met on this walk. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion as you walk, and there are always these go-to discussion starters. The first one was always, where did you start? Everybody wanted to know, what city did you start in walking the Camino? Because you can start in various places. The other one was, why are you walking? That was easy for me. I explained this was time with my son. This was a sabbatical. Usually, inevitably, the questions came to your family, and then what you do, what's your vocation? Now, trying to explain what I do in life, I found to be particularly hard on the Camino. I've been in vocational ministry for 34 years now, and I would try to articulate that to them. And then they would say something like, so what do you mean, you're a priest? And I was like, no, not a priest. What I do is I lead and I teach a faith community that's in the city center of this heart of the city. And we gather once a week, and we try to live out what we believe as we follow Jesus throughout our whole lives. And they go, oh yeah, so you're a priest. And I go, no, not a priest. But that was it. That they had found their category for me, and that was it. Well, being outed as a priest always seemed to kill the conversation from that point on. These pilgrims, and they were called pilgrims. You walk the Camino, you're a pilgrim. For these pilgrims on the Camino, somehow my vocation as a priest had little to do with whatever it was they were searching for on this spiritual walk. Their notion of what constituted a spiritual life clearly had no place for people like me in it, honestly. And their spirituality had no way of engaging with or interpreting mine or any other form of Christianity they had ever seen represented. So I found myself as a professional Christian walking the spiritual pilgrimage with no idea how to connect my experience of God in any way that might resonate with whatever these fellow pilgrims were searching for as they walked these hundreds and hundreds of miles throughout rural Spain. I honestly had this feeling of a helplessness a little bit, not knowing how to communicate this. I think of the story that David Foster Wallace tells in his famous commencement speech at Kenyon College years and years ago. He talked about these two fish that were swimming along, and an older fish came by, and as they crossed each other's path, the older fish looked up and said, "Morning, fellas, how's the water?" And then they swim on their way. And after a few minutes, the two younger fish swimming by, one of them looks at the other one and goes, "What the hell's water?" It's this whole idea that they had no idea what they were swimming in, and they've been doing it their whole lives. These people that I were meeting on the Camino on a spiritual pilgrimage had no idea what they were swimming in. But I, this professional Christian, this vocational minister, evidently had no idea how to explain it, to communicate it, to proclaim it, whichever word you want to use. This inability to recognize and respond to these types of moments is what the scholar Walter Brueggemann refers to as a crisis of interpretation. A crisis that results in followers of Jesus being robbed of the capacity to speak, to care, to notice those on a trail in rural Spain or anywhere in between. It's this crisis of interpretation that for us in this talk is the focus. So what is it that we have done to put ourselves in this position of helplessness? Well, I think it has something to do with the fact that we've taken a God that I believe is this big, as far as I can reach, and made him into something much, much smaller. I think we have lost a sense of the big story that makes sense of all our little stories. And I believe we are guilty of a great reduction. And this reduction, I believe, is based upon heretical thinking. Now, how you define the word heresy here is very important. I'm not talking about how we normally think of the word heresy, as a false teaching of sorts, a denial of truth and affirming of something false. That's not what I mean by the word heresy here. I'm defining it as N.T. Wright does. The greatest heresies do not come about by straightforward denial. They happen when an element, which may even be important but isn't central, looms so large that people can't help talking about it, fixating on it, debating different views of it as though this were the only thing that mattered. The point is that the so-called heretic really has rediscovered some truth that has been lost, ignored, or suppressed. That is something to get excited about. But the error, however, in the heresy is the exaggerated enthusiasm or the preoccupation that follows. The heretic, again in this form of the word, becomes increasingly obsessive, sectarian, and they make this newly recovered particular truth into the whole truth. And so truth then, capital T, becomes fragmented. The poet Rumi lamented the shattering of truth. He says, "The truth was a mirror in the hands of God. It fell and it broke into pieces. Everybody took a piece of it, they looked at it, and they thought they had the truth." You're probably familiar. It's the same truth that the old parable of the 4 blind men with an elephant, the point it makes, where they each take a piece of the elephant and they think they found the whole thing. When they describe it, they've really just described a portion. It's the same thing. And by the way, this doesn't happen just with theology. We can see that this sort of reductionism affects everything. It happens when ideas, theological, political, or sociological, are reduced and distilled into a singular controlling ideology through which the insiders interpret and organize their world. So the result of this, when it comes to our understanding of God, is we feel like, I don't know, that we have God in our back pocket, that he is controllable and manageable. This is what we do with the word doctrine. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. This is not about doctrine being bad. This is not about it not being a good thing. This is instead about reducing God down to only a doctrine. When we reduce God down to a manageable size, I believe God becomes propaganda rather than God. God is always bigger. God is always more. And I actually believe it was the heresy of reductionism that got the religious leaders to kill Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Fascinating story in Acts chapter 7. My belief is in this story, we identify much more with those who did the killing, though, than with the victim. If you read it from this angle, it gives us insight into the toxic ways of thinking that honestly all religious people are susceptible to. I think it's safe to assume that those who killed Stephen saw themselves as responsible for protecting the religious tradition come hell or high water. They could not engage Stephen in an authentic conversation about God because of their immovable religious commitments, which they would protect to the hilt before considering other ways of understanding God. So much so that they were even willing to kill people in order to protect their beliefs. That's heretical. These commitments implied they presumed to know exactly how God works, and therefore they refused to make room for anything a professed visionary like Stephen might proclaim. So if you read Stephen's amazing speech in Acts chapter 7, you notice that he warned against this heresy. Again, Wright's definition. He warned against the heresy that God only dwells in the temple. The prophets have been saying that for a long, long time, so this wasn't anything new. Stephen did not say that the Jerusalem temple is inherently idolatrous. Rather, he claims that members of his audience that were listening to him had come to treat the temple in an idolatrous manner. They assigned way too much importance to the temple, and in doing so, they were unable to glimpse other places and other ways that God promised to be present. They were missing it. Matthew Skinner, who has written a great deal and wonderful stuff on Acts chapter 7, says Stephen's story is not about the bad guys. It's about coming to terms with the reality that all of us are prone to reject God's messengers and cling ferociously to what we already know or think we know very well. So I think we have to be asking the questions, something like, are we too defining reduced truths? Are we too defending reduced truths? Are we too defending a system of belief, a God in a box? Have we grasped a leg of an elephant and made a calling out proclaiming that we're holding the entire animal? Have we taken a truth that's this big and made it this big? I think we have. And I think it's a crisis of interpretation because I see the results everywhere. Khalid Keith Perry describes it in very, I think, poetic, beautiful language when he describes what he sees this way. Ossified doctrines, where ideas are believed but not lived, and faith degenerates into religious ideology. He calls them wooden proclamations, where little resonates with the people beyond and inside the church, and theological boredom becomes the order of the day. He says empty doxologies, where ritualized religion replaces true worship with no relationship to the eternal and universal perspective. And finally, legalistic ethics, where discipleship is reduced to religious moralism and shame and guilt replace freedom. Those are some powerful phrases and powerful images for us to consider what is actually going on. There is this book by Josh Packard and Ashley Hope called Church Refugees, just this tiny little book. You may have come across it. And in the book, they attempt to wrestle with what I believe is the crux of this crisis in their research on what are known as the nuns and the duns. In the nuns and the duns, they spoke to many people in their research. And there were some common tensions that emerged from their research. See if these resonate with you and see if they resonate with people that you know. They're saying that the nuns and nuns wanted community, but they got judgment. They wanted to affect the life of the church, but they got bureaucracy. They wanted conversation and got doctrine. They wanted meaningful engagement with the world and got moral prescription. So based upon that, you see, I think the pilgrims on the Camino, that we want to experience God, understand what we've done before we do. I think the nuns and the nuns know more about what we're doing than we recognize what we're doing. They know we are trying to propagate them. They know we're trying to sell them something, and that's not what they're looking for. And they also know that what we are giving them is ossified, wooden, empty, and legalistic. And it lacks potency. It comes off as a system and not a lifestyle. And the worst part, like I said, is they know it before we do. That's what I experienced on the Camino. You see, our reduction of God has resulted in, and this goes to this idea of crisis of interpretation, it has resulted in a reduction of story. I believe in our reductions, we have taken this unbelievably powerful, beautiful story of Jesus and the good news, and we have siphoned it, drained it of its power. The author, Pastor Don Everts, he says we have made him into a tofu savior. Square, tasteless, and bland. Excuse me. Tofu is, by the way, if you didn't know, is actually a curd made from mashed soybeans. Okay, so no disrespect to you tofu lovers out there. Seriously, none intended. Some call tofu a flavored sponge. It doesn't have much taste. It just takes up the taste of food around it. Here's my question. Have we done that with the story of Jesus? Have we simply let it sit next to our own ideas and let it soak up our own philosophies? I actually believe we have, socially, politically, economically, all over the place. Now, in contrast, Everts talks about, he said, have you ever had a warhead? Do you know? Here's a picture of warhead candy. If you put one of these things in your mouth, your body immediately has one of two reactions. It's either, I feel alive and everything is now in color, or the other half of you is going, spit this thing out. It's horrible. So here's Everett's deep theological conclusion. The story of Jesus, the good news, is like a warhead. Read the Gospels, you'll see it. Either the people are spitting him out, or they're saying, I don't know what's going on here, but I am alive like I've never been alive. The way Jesus told the story of God made people either drop everything and follow him, or they wanted to push him off the cliffs. Just look at Luke chapter 4. He goes in and gives this message in the synagogue. It wasn't what he said in the message that got them to try to push him off the cliff after he was done. It was the fact that he said, you know what? And everyone is invited. And they're like, no, get this out. No, this is not what we want. It's way too radical. See, I think the temptation in the telling of the story of God is to settle for curd made from mashed soybeans for two key reasons. First, I think because we have a fear of presenting a Jesus who is far too counterintuitive and far more offensive to our already settled lives, and we don't want that. Or secondly, because we have an incorrect belief that if we tell of a Jesus who is more palatable and culturally applicable, it will be much easier for people to accept him in the teachings. We just want to make it easier for them. I think that's why we do this. Either reason, though, results in us telling a reduced story, siphoned of its transformative power, and drained of its restorative influence. So then, in light of this crisis, let me present to you what I believe are three ways that we actually make tofu in our telling of the story of God putting the world back together. I believe we do three things, and I'll define each of these for you. But we demythologize, we demystify, and we de-poeticize the story of God. Now, I can't get to the depths of each of these words like I want to, but let me give you a quick overview. When I talk about demythologizing, I think we are guilty of removing myth from the story we tell. Now, just like the word heresy, the word myth carries with it mostly a negative connotation. It's often dismissed as, oh, that's a myth. It was made up. It's untrue, like the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus or something like that. That's not how I'm using the word myth. I'm defining myth as those stories that contain the roots of defining themes that have cultural, religious, or spiritual significance. They are stories that guide, orient, illuminate whole peoples and generations. They are the narrative frames through which we understand our roles in the world. So to say that a story is mythic in this sense, therefore, is not to say, oh, it's just mere fantasy. That's not what I'm saying. Quite the opposite. By appealing to the power of myth, and there are plenty of people that have written about this, by appealing to the power of myth, we give ordinary, everyday things new vitality. We give them new meaning by which life is reoriented and reframed. Most of you probably know of C.S. Lewis's great conversion story on Addison's Walk there in Oxford, and how he came to understand he'd gone from belief to non-belief to theism to hadn't bought into the Jesus thing, and on that night along Addison's Walk there, he came to understand, and this is in the conversation with Tolkien, he came to understand Jesus as the true myth. Well, what Lewis does is explains that a reader, after entering into an experience with a real, true myth, may very well say, I shall never escape this. This will never escape me. These images have stuck roots far below the surface of my mind. It's something that you either want to get out or let it enliven your life. It's like warhead candy. Lewis also said the real value of myth is that it takes all the things we know and restores them to the rich significance that's been hidden by a veil of familiarity. Here's Lewis's most famous quote on this. The child enjoys his cold meats, otherwise dull to him, by pretending it is a buffalo, just killed with his own bow and arrow, and the child is wise. The real meat comes back to him far tastier for having been dipped in a story. You might say that only then is it the real meat. If you are tired of the old real landscape, look at it in a mirror. By putting bread, gold, horse, apple, or the very roads into a myth, we do not retreat from reality, we rediscover it. You see, when we lose a sense of the mythic dimensions of the story of God, we end up with a low resonance proclamation that fails to reach our souls, whether it's collectively or individually. We lose the ability to make sense in a senseless world. We lose the ability to give significance to our existence because we consistently drain the good news of its potency and power and allow it to absorb the flavors of the foods that surround it, like tofu. I think we demythologize the story of God. I think we also demystify the second way to make tofu. Basically, we take out the mystery. Those nuns and duns that I talked about earlier only see a gospel, I believe, that is about answers, not about the questions, not about the bigness of God. And they don't see a story that cannot be contained. They see a story that can be put in our back pocket or written on a napkin. They only see us closing doors to wonder and mystery instead of leading people through those doors. Overcoming the crisis of interpretation is realizing we've demystified this story of God. Albert Einstein, he says, the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. Whoever does not know it and can no longer wonder, no longer marvel, is as good as dead, and his eyes are dimmed. It is to a culture with dim eyes that we want to attempt to engage in a conversation that moves people beyond numb resignation and opens them up to the hope of finding God outside their dogmas and certitudes. Our ability to enter into mystery has all but disappeared in the church, at least in my experience. And again, I've been in vocational ministry. I've been the lead pastor of a church for the last 15 years. And speaking as a pastor, what I'm trying to do when we gather together is I'm not looking to have the last word on a subject when I communicate in a gathering. I'm simply looking to begin the conversation, to have the first word. If after some Sunday gathering of worship, people walk away and go, yeah, I understand everything now, I have all the answers, I will have failed. But if they leave with more questions than answers, I will have succeeded. I will have missed the chance. If I just give them the answers, I will have missed the chance to invite them into the mystery. Not something that they cannot understand, but something they can endlessly understand. That's the definition of mystery that I love. I tell our community often, look, I'm not your Bible answer man. I know just enough to know that I don't know as much as I should know. I want our community, our faith community, our church to see and experience my wonder, to see me enter into mystery, to join me in this mystery. I want them to know we're doing this spiritual thing together. And we have lost that. We've lost our wonder, and we've lost our mystery. And it's not even just in the church that we've lost that. Donna Moore, who writes about Abraham Heschel seemed to specialize in wonder, if you will. He said, our educational system stresses the importance of controlling and exploiting reality, of deriving power from knowledge. But there is little education for wonder, for the sublime. We carefully teach children how to measure and weigh and spell, but we fail to teach them how to revere, how to admire, how to appreciate. The sense of wonder and awe, the sense for the sublime, is such a rare gift. Without it, the world becomes flat and the human person hollow. The third way I think we make tofu is we de-poeticize. In the church's attempt to gain a rational grasp of God, to manage and systemize the story of God's incarnation, we have left our experience and proclamation of the divine with very little originality, very little creativity, and very little artistry. That's what I call de-poeticizing the story. It's removing the creative, imaginative side of telling the story of God. In what should be the most powerful and beautiful story of creation, separation, rescue, restoration, however you want to tell the whole story, we have reduced the magnificence and the grandeur. Instead of being spiked with a dash of warhead candy, it's been laced with tofu. I read a story about David Lipscomb. Lipscomb was a very important leader, religious leader and educator in the second half of the 19th century. Greatly admired. And I greatly admire him. I disagree with him on one point that he made. He was known to have warned his hearers that they were to read the Bible narrowly, always taking it in the most literal sense. Such an approach, and here's a quote, he claimed, keeps man on safe ground and clips the wings of imagination and speculation and makes the Bible the only and safest teacher of duty to man. Okay, now I understand the logic behind that quote, but I think he goes too far. Lipscomb's mentor was an influential man named Tolbert Fanning, and it appears it was from Fanning that Lipscomb inherited his negative assessment of imagination. In a eulogy given for Fanning, this was said, "He waved no plumes, wreathed no garlands, but struck from the shoulders and at the vitals." And then this line, "He was destitute of poetry and barren of imagination." Okay, now just to be clear, eulogies are intended to represent the highest of praise for someone. Eulogies are meant to summarize their life in a way that lauds them. What boggles the mind then is trying to comprehend what kind of reasoning and logic considers the words destitute of poetry and barren of imagination as high praise and worthy of a eulogy. To me, that is one sorrowful lament. A failure to engage God in the Bible poetically and imaginatively means we will likely misread both, because we are forcing our experiences of the sacred to speak in linear, informational categories as opposed to entering into the world of metaphors and parables and evocative language. It's like in trying to interpret a multi-dimensional reality with a one-dimensional method. It flattens the revelation of God. It is this de-poeticized, this destitute and barren perspective of theology, of God and the story of Jesus that I think contributes greatly to a story that's been reduced to a curd made from mashed soybeans. Again, I'm simply trying to unpack this crisis. And I believe in doing so, we have to take responsibility for this crisis. Any and all followers of Jesus do. My feeling of hopelessness on the roads of the Camino are feelings of hopelessness when we see the statistics about the nuns and the duns. These are not the fault of our Creator. I don't believe the problem is Jesus. We've not been given a story of good news that is just too hard to tell. The crisis of interpretation results from our stewardship of this story. So Paul mentions this idea of stewardship of this mystery, of this story, a couple times. Here are a couple verses. Colossians 1, I am a servant appointed by God to preach the word of God until it is known to you and all over. What I am talking about is nothing less than the mystery of the ages. And then he says, 1 Corinthians 4:1, rather than power brokers, think of us as servants of the Anointed One, the liberating King, caretakers of the mystery of God. Caretakers of the mystery of God. We are to be stewards of this mystery. We are to be caretakers. It's not the story that's the problem. It's the stewardship of that story. Brueggemann says the gospel is a truth widely held, but a truth greatly reduced. It is a truth that has been flattened, trivialized, and rendered inane. We've done that, and we have to own that. Our framework of God has been reduced, which has led to the reduction of the radical story of Jesus, which in turn results in a life that reflects those same reductionisms. So here's what I'm making a call for. It's a call to reframe, to put a new frame around an old picture. When you take a picture and you put a frame around it, you don't change that picture, but you change the way that picture is perceived. You give that picture a chance to be looked at a second, a third, a fourth, a brand new, fresh way. Remember, our goal is not to change the story of God, but rather to take a picture that we have all grown accustomed to and surround it with a new frame, one that allows us to see the picture afresh. The reframing, again, does not change the picture, but it allows for the second thought, a third thought. It enables us to see a picture that we have too easily defined, that we have too easily contained, that we have siphoned out the breadth of mystery and meaning that every pilgrim on any trail longs to experience. I have always felt that was my calling, to put these frames around pictures. And I am convinced it is all of our, in the midst of this crisis of interpretation, I am convinced it is all of our callings. To reframe this good news, to reframe a God that is this big and not this big, and allow the people that we encounter on any trail we walk to experience that story in a way that just blows their mind.